Have you ever wondered why governments spend money they don't have during a recession? Or why central banks slash interest rates to get people spending again? The answer, in large part, goes back to one man, John Maynard Keynes. The intellectual giant who didn't just study economics, he fundamentally reinvented it for the modern world. Today, we're diving deep into the life and ideas of the man who dared to say that sometimes the free market gets it wrong, and that we, collectively, can do something about it. This is the story of how a brilliant, rebellious thinker from Cambridge built the intellectual architecture that governments still use to manage our economies today. John Maynard Keynes was born in 1883 in Cambridge, England, into a family that was the very definition of intellectual aristocracy. His father was an economist and logician at Cambridge University, and his mother was a pioneering social reformer who would eventually become the mayor of Cambridge. Growing up in this environment, Keynes was immersed in the great debates of the late Victorian era. Britain was at the peak of its imperial power, a global network connected by steamships and telegraph cables. But beneath this veneer of confidence, there were deep anxieties about poverty, inequality, and the jarring boom and bust cycles of industrial capitalism. From a young age, Keynes was a prodigy. He earned a scholarship to Eton, the most prestigious school in England, and then went on to King's College, Cambridge. He wasn't just a math whiz, he was also drawn to philosophy and the arts. At Cambridge, he became a key member of the Bloomsbury Group, a circle of influential artists, writers, and thinkers including Virginia Woolf and E.M. Forster. They challenged the rigid conventions of Victorian society and believed that the ultimate goal of life and, by extension, of policy should be human flourishing, not just abstract rules or economic efficiency. This blend of rigorous mathematical logic and a deep concern for human well-being would become the defining feature of Keynes's entire career. His first real-world test came not in a classroom, but in the corridors of power. Before the First World War, Keynes took a job at the India office, analyzing the complex financial machinery of the British Empire. This wasn't just a desk job. It gave him a first-hand look at how monetary policy in London could have life-or-death consequences. For millions of people, thousands of miles away. He quickly became a master of the system, but also a skeptic of its orthodoxies. When war broke out in 1914, Keynes's talents were desperately needed at the British Treasury. He was a central figure in financing the Allied war effort, a monumental task that involved managing unprecedented levels of debt and international loans. He saw, up close, how a government could mobilize an entire economy for a single purpose. But it was the aftermath of the war that would transform him from a brilliant civil servant into a global intellectual revolutionary. As a delegate to the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, Keynes was horrified by the Allied leaders' decision to impose crippling war reparations on a defeated Germany. He argued passionately that crushing the German economy would not only be unjust, but would sow the seeds of future conflict. He saw the negotiations not as a mathematical exercise, but as a moral and political catastrophe in the making. When his warnings were ignored, he did something unthinkable for a man in his position. He resigned in protest. He channeled his outrage into a book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. It was an overnight sensation. In blistering, eloquent prose, Keynes predicted that the punitive treaty would lead to economic collapse in Germany, fostering political instability and extremism. He wrote, "If we aim at the impoverishment of Central Europe, vengeance, I dare say, will not limp." It was a chillingly accurate prophecy of the rise of Nazism. This moment was a turning point. For Keynes, economics could no longer be a detached, academic discipline. It had to be a tool for preventing human suffering and building a more stable, just world. To understand just how revolutionary Keynes's ideas were, we need to look at the economic landscape he inherited. At the turn of the 20th century, the dominant school of thought was what we now call classical economics. Its central belief was that free markets are inherently, if unemployment rises, wages will fall until everyone who wants a job can find one. If there's a downturn, prices and interest rates will adjust automatically to restore balance or equilibrium. The best thing a government could do, according to this view, was to get out of the way. Keynes's own mentor at Cambridge, Alfred Marshall, was the grand master of this tradition, but even Marshall's elegant models of supply and demand seemed to falter in the face of the prolonged mass unemployment that began to plague industrial nations. Another major figure was Arthur Cecil P., who argued that governments could step in to correct market failures, like pollution. Keynes learned from Pigou, but he felt a bigger piece of the puzzle was missing. Across the Atlantic, American economist Irving Fisher was developing sophisticated theories about money and prices, but his boundless optimism right before the 1929 Wall Street crash showed the dangerous blind spots of the classical view. Meanwhile, the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter was talking about creative destruction, the idea that capitalism progresses through turbulent cycles where old industries are destroyed to make way for new ones. For Schumpeter, a recession was a healthy cleansing process. But for Keynes, looking at millions of unemployed workers and idle factories, this was madness. He famously retorted, "In the long run, we are all dead." Waiting for the market to self-correct was not a viable solution when people were suffering right now. His most famous intellectual sparring partner was Friedrich Hayek. Their debates at the London School of Economics in the 1930s became legendary. Hayek, representing the Austrian school, argued that government intervention, especially printing money, distorted the price signals that allow a market to function. A recession, he believed, was the necessary, painful cure for the mistakes made during an artificial boom. Keynes fundamentally disagreed. He argued that the problem wasn't a necessary correction. It was a catastrophic failure of demand. He saw economies as being driven not just by rational calculations, but by what he called animal spirits, the waves of optimism and pessimism that sweep through investors and consumers. In a downturn, everyone becomes fearful. Businesses stop investing, and consumers stop spending. This creates a vicious cycle. Less spending leads to lower profits, which leads to layoffs, which leads to even less spending. The economy could get stuck in a rut of high unemployment indefinitely. This was the intellectual crisis that Keynes set out to solve. He didn't want to tear down capitalism. He wanted to save it from itself. He synthesized the analytical tools of his predecessors, but rejected their fatalistic conclusions. He set out to build a new framework, a general theory that could explain why economies crash, and, more importantly, what we can do about it. The stage was set for the Great Depression to test his theories, and for Keynes to write the book that would change the world, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. But that's a story for our next chapter. Keynes's ideas weren't just abstract theories. They provided a concrete roadmap for a world spiraling into the Great Depression. His masterpiece, published in 1936, argued that the core problem was a collapse in aggregate demand. The solution, therefore, was for someone to step in and start spending. And the only entity powerful enough to do that in a major crisis was the government. He proposed that, during a slump, the government should engage in fiscal policy, cutting taxes to leave more money in people's pockets, and, crucially, increasing its own spending. This could mean building roads, bridges, dams, and schools. Keynes argued that it almost didn't matter what the money was spent on. The point was to inject demand into the economy. This government spending would create a multiplier effect. A construction worker hired for a public project would spend their wages at the local grocery store. The grocer would then use that income to pay their supplier, and so on. Each dollar of government spending would ripple through the economy, creating several dollars of new income and activity. Alongside fiscal policy, Keynes emphasized the role of monetary policy. He argued that the central bank should lower interest rates to make it cheaper for businesses to borrow and invest, and for consumers to take out loans. This challenged the old idea that saving was always virtuous. In a depression, Keynes said, too much saving or hoarding was the problem. We needed to encourage spending and investment to get the wheels of the economy turning again. His ideas were radical. They directly contradicted the conventional wisdom of balancing budgets at all costs. To his critics, this was a recipe for irresponsible debt and inflation. But to a generation of policymakers staring into the abyss of economic collapse and social unrest, Keynesianism offered a lifeline. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal in the United States, with its massive public works programs, became the most famous real-world application of Keynesian principles, even if FDR didn't explicitly follow Keynes's script.
Then came World War II. The massive deficit-financed government spending required for the war effort provided a dramatic, validation of Keynes's theory.
Nations ramped up production on an unprecedented scale, and unemployment, the scourge of the 1930s, simply vanished.
The war demonstrated, beyond any doubt, that a government could mobilize its economy to achieve full employment. After the war, Keynes's influence was at its zenith. He was the chief British negotiator at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the meeting that designed the entire post-war international economic system. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were created, in large part, to prevent the kind of economic chaos that had led to the Great Depression and World War II. The post-war era, from roughly 1945 to the early 1970s, became known as the Age of Keynes. Governments in the West actively managed their economies using fiscal and monetary tools, aiming for a balance of low unemployment and stable growth. It was a period of unprecedented, widely shared prosperity. But no theory is perfect, and no golden age lasts forever.
By the 1970s, the Keynesian consensus began to fracture.
Economies were hit by a strange new problem called stagflation, a toxic mix of stagnant growth, high unemployment, and high inflation. Keynesian theory struggled to explain this. Critics, most notably Milton Friedman and the monetarist school, argued that decades of government intervention had distorted the economy, leading to runaway inflation without delivering sustainable growth. The pendulum began to swing back toward free market ideas. Yet, the story doesn't end there. When the global financial crisis hit in 2008, the world faced its most severe downturn since the Great Depression. And what did policymakers around the globe do? They instinctively reached for the Keynesian playbook. Governments unleashed massive stimulus packages, and central banks cut interest rates to near zero. They bailed out banks and injected trillions of dollars into the financial system to prevent a total collapse of aggregate demand.
The spirit of Keynes was back.
Today, we live in a world shaped by his legacy. The debates between stimulus and austerity, between government intervention and free markets, are fundamentally Keynesian debates. His central insight that markets are not always self-correcting and that we have the tools to fight recessions and mass unemployment remains the foundation of modern macroeconomics. John Maynard Keynes was more than just an economist. He was an intellectual architect who gave us a new way to think about our collective economic fate. He taught us that we are not simply passive victims of economic forces, but active agents who can shape a more stable and prosperous future. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the life and ideas of John Maynard Keynes.
If you found this exploration of economic history fascinating,
please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the thinkers who shaped our world.
let me know in the comments what you think. Is Keynes still relevant today?
Until next time,
Stay curious.